40 below zero, and the wind has been screaming across the Wind River Valley for 3 days straight. January 1912. Every cabin roof in the basin carries 4 feet of snow. Every window is frosted blind. Every chimney fights to stay lit against gusts that snuff flame like wet fingers on a wick. From a ridge above the valley, looking down, you would see nothing alive. Not a horse, not a dog, not a single curl of smoke from any direction, because the wind shears it away before it can rise. But then your eye catches something impossible. Low on a hillside where the sage and the brown grass have long since vanished under white, a thin thread of smoke lifts straight from the bare ground itself. No cabin, no chimney, no structure of any kind visible to the naked eye, just earth and snow, and that single line of warmth rising from below, as if the hill were breathing. Someone is alive down there. Someone who understood something the rest of the valley forgot. If you're the kind of person who wants to know how a 58-year-old widow outbuilt, outlasted, and outthought every rancher in western Wyoming, using nothing but dirt and dead grass, you're going to want to stay for this one. Subscribe now, because this story only gets stranger from here. 4 months earlier, September 1911. The light in the Wind River Basin turns gold around the 3rd week of the month. And it was gold on the morning Dorrit Skaale walked the fence line along the eastern boundary of her 160 acres. She walked it every Tuesday and Friday, had walked it every Tuesday and Friday for 22 years first, beside her husband Ansel, then alone. The posts were lodgepole pine cut and set by Ansel's hands before Dorrit's hair had gone gray, and some of them leaned now like tired men propping themselves against a wind that never fully stopped. She carried a hammer, a coffee can full of staples, and a leather pouch of baling wire. No gloves. Her hands had not needed gloves for fence work since she was 35. Ansel Skaale had died 11 months ago, thrown from a horse during an early October storm that came in sideways off the Absaroka range and turned the trail to glass. The horse survived. Ansel did not. He broke his neck against a boulder the size of a feed trough. And by the time Dorrit found him, the rain had washed most of the blood into the soil, and he looked almost peaceful, almost like a man napping in an odd place. She buried him on the south slope where the columbines came up in June, and she did not cry at the burial, because there were 40 head of cattle that needed moving to lower pasture, and crying would not move them. Now it was September, and the cattle numbered 38. 2 lost to wolves in March, and Dorrit had not replaced them because replacing them meant a trip to Riverton, and Riverton meant questions from men in clean shirts about whether a woman her age ought to be running a place alone. She did not need their questions. She needed the fence to hold. At the northeast corner post she stopped, pressed her palm flat against the wood. It was warm. Not from sun, the sun was still behind the ridge, but from the ground. The soil at the base of the post held warmth the way a stone hearth holds warmth hours after the fire dies. She had noticed this before many times over many years, and had never thought much of it. Ground temperature runs steady. Everybody knew that. 50 degrees 52 year-round below the frost line. But this morning, with the air already carrying that particular dry bite that September gets in the high basin, the warmth under her palm felt almost deliberate, almost like a message. She pulled a leather-bound notebook from her coat pocket. Small hand-stitched pages dense with her own cramped handwriting. 20 years of weather records. Date, temperature at dawn, temperature at noon, wind direction, precipitation, first frost, first snow, last snow river, level, well depth, every day for 20 years. She flipped it to the September pages and ran her thumb down the columns. The pattern was there. She had seen it forming since July. Warmer than normal through summer. Drier. Grasshoppers worse than usual. Elk moving to lower ground 3 weeks early. The signs were lining up the way they had lined up only once before in her memory. 1888, the year of the Great Blizzard. She had been 35, then married 7 years, watching Ansel board up windows with a kind of grim efficiency that frightened her more than the wind. Peder had been 9, too young to understand the silence that came after the wind stopped, old enough to remember the cattle they found, frozen upright in the north pasture. Cattle across the territory died by the tens of thousands that winter. Men froze to death between their front doors and their barns. The cold came so fast and so hard that birds fell from the sky mid-flight, dead before they hit the ground. Dorrit closed the notebook, looked west toward the Absaroka range where the peaks were already dusted white. The cabin she lived in was 31 years old. The roof leaked in 2 places. The chinking between the logs had crumbled in a dozen spots she hadn't had time to repair. The stone fireplace had a crack running from the mantel to the flue, and on bad nights the crack whistled like a man calling a dog. The cabin had been adequate for 22 years, but adequate was a word that only worked when the weather was ordinary. And the weather, her notebook told her, was not going to be ordinary. On the 2nd day of October, Dorrit Skaale arrived in a rented buggy from Casper. He was 32, clean-shaven, with the particular kind of posture that comes from sitting at a desk 5 days a week and feeling important about it. He worked for the Fremont Consolidated Mining Company as a land acquisitions clerk, which meant he spent his days persuading people to sell things they loved. He was not bad at it. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he used both with a salesman's awareness of which tool worked on which person. He brought papers. He always brought papers. Dorrit was skinning an elk she had shot that morning when he pulled up to the porch. She did not stop skinning. The knife moved in long, careful strokes, separating hide from muscle, with a sound like tearing wet cloth. Peder climbed down from the buggy, looked at the elk hanging from the porch beam, and set his jaw the way Ansel used to set his when the well went dry. Mother. Peder. He placed a leather folder on the porch railing. Fremont Consolidated is offering $1,200 for the full section. That's 3 times what father paid. The knife kept moving. Dorrit's hands were red to the wrists. The elk steamed in the cold air. The money would set you up in Casper. Heated rooms, a doctor within walking distance. No more of this. She pulled a strip of sinew free and laid it across the railing beside his folder. The sinew was translucent, still warm. Your father paid $400 for this land because the man who sold it thought it was worthless. Your father was right and that man was wrong. That hasn't changed. Father died on this land. Dorrit stopped cutting. She looked at her son. Her eyes were the color of creek water in November gray-green and very still. Your father died because a storm turned the trail to ice and his horse went down. The land didn't kill him. The land held him for 22 years and fed us every one of those years and will go on feeding me as long as I let it. Peder opened his mouth, closed it. He was smart enough to know when a negotiation was lost, and he was his mother's son enough to recognize the particular quality of silence that followed her voice when she was finished speaking. He left the folder on the railing. He climbed back into the buggy. At the gate he turned. Think about it, please. She did not answer. She went back to the elk. The folder stayed on the railing through the night, through a light rain that softened the edges of the paper inside. And in the morning, she carried it into the cabin and set it on the kitchen table under a jar of dried yarrow. She did not open it. She did not throw it away. 3 weeks later, the rain came hard. Not snow, not yet, but a heavy driving autumn rain that lasted 4 days and turned the creek into a brown torrent and the pasture into a shallow lake. The cattle huddled against the south fence, miserable and lowing. Dorrit spent the days in the barn repairing tack, sharpening tools, listening to the roof drum. On the 5th day, the rain stopped and the sky broke open like a cracked egg, yellow-white and enormous, and steam rose from every surface. She rode out to check the herd. Counted 37. 1 missing. She tracked the stray northeast toward the back ridge where the sage grew thick and the ground rose in a series of low rounded hills that the Shoshone people had once called the Sleeping Shoulders. She found the cow at the base of the 3rd hill, standing in a shallow depression, lowing softly at nothing. Dorrit dismounted. The depression was not natural. She had ridden this ground 100 times, and the depression had not been there before. Or rather, it had been there but hidden under sage and bunch grass, and the rain had scoured the vegetation away and revealed what lay beneath. A circle, roughly 40 feet across. The soil inside the circle was darker than the soil outside, compacted differently, slightly concave, like a shallow bowl pressed into the hillside. At the center, 3 dark stubs protruded from the ground. Not rocks, wood. Ancient crumbling blackened wood, the remains of posts driven into the earth so long ago that the grain had turned to powder. She knelt, pressed her fingers into the dark soil. It was warm, warmer than the air, warmer than the surrounding ground, warm in a way that startled her, even though she knew the physics. Below the frost line, earth holds steady. But this circle felt warmer still, as if the compacted floor retained some memory of heat, some imprint of the fires that had once burned at its center. She dug with her hands. 6 inches down she found charcoal, fragments of bone brittle and white, a flat stone smooth on one side, rough on the other, placed with obvious intention, not tossed, not tumbled, but set. A hearthstone. Someone had lived here. Someone had built a structure in this exact spot, circular, semi-subterranean with heavy center posts, and had kept a fire burning at its heart and had been warm. Dorrit sat back on her heels. The cow had wandered off. The valley stretched below her, golden and brown, with the line of the Wind River glinting through the cottonwoods. The Absaroka range stood white against a sky so blue it hurt. She looked at the circle in the ground and understood with the quiet certainty of a woman who had read the land for 22 years that this was not a random thing. This was architecture. This was engineering. This was someone's answer to the same question she was asking. How do you survive a winter that kills everything above ground? You go below it. She rode to the reservation on a Thursday. The road from her ranch to the eastern edge of the Wind River Reservation was 11 miles of packed dirt and sage, and she covered it in 2 hours at a steady walk, because hurrying a horse on unfamiliar ground was how Ansel had died, and she was not going to make the same mistake in a different season. Josiah Whitehawk lived in a one-room cabin at the end of a track that branched off the main road and wound through a stand of cottonwoods before dead-ending at a creek. She had met him twice before, once at the general store in Dubois, where he had been buying salt and she had been buying nails, and they had exchanged 11 words about the price of both. Once at the cattle auction in Riverton, where he had been watching from the fence, and she had nodded to him, and he had nodded back. She did not know his age. 70 perhaps, perhaps older. His face was the color of old leather, and creased in ways that suggested not hardship, but attention, as though every line had been carved by looking closely at something. He was sitting on a stump outside his cabin, doing nothing. Doing nothing in a way that suggested he was doing something she couldn't see. Mr. Whitehawk. He looked at her, did not stand, did not speak. I found something on my land, up on the sleeping shoulders, a circle in the ground, 40 feet across, posts in the center, charcoal. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a magpie landed on the woodpile behind him, squawked twice, and flew away. Long enough that Dorrit began to wonder if she had given offense, though she did not know how. My grandparents slept in the earth. The earth held warmth better than wood. He said it the way a man says something he has known so long that the knowing has become part of his breathing. Not a revelation, not a lesson, just a fact worn smooth by decades of carrying it. How was it built? Another silence. Then the doorway faces east, always east. Dorrit waited. Josiah looked past her toward the ridgeline, towards something she could not see, and he perhaps could no longer see either. Only remember. He did not explain why east. He did not offer measurements or methods or materials. He gave her one sentence, and the sentence was enough, because it told her that the structure had a doorway, that the doorway had a direction, and that the direction mattered. The rest she would have to find herself. She thanked him. He acknowledged the thanks with a movement of his head so small it might have been the wind. She rode home. 11 miles. 2 hours. The whole way she thought about doorways facing east and why east. And the answer came to her somewhere around mile 7, riding through a draw where the wind funneled hard from the northwest. East meant the entrance faced away from the prevailing wind. East meant the tunnel, if there was a tunnel, would not catch the full force of a winter storm. East meant the cold air, heavy and sinking, would pool in the tunnel's lowest point and never reach the living space above. It was so simple, so obvious. And yet every cabin in the valley, including her own, had its door facing whichever direction happened to be convenient when the builder got tired of thinking about it. The first snow came on the 3rd of November, 3 weeks ahead of normal. It came not gently but with violence, a horizontal blast that turned the air white and dropped 6 inches in 4 hours. Dorrit stood at her cabin window and watched the posts of her fence disappear one by one, swallowed by white. The roof leaked in both of the places it always leaked, plus a new place above the kitchen she hadn't known about. She set buckets under the drips and listened to the arrhythmic plinking that would be her companion until spring. The fireplace crack whistled. The draft it created was strong enough to make the candle on the mantel lean sideways. She stuffed it with rags. The rags would freeze by morning shrink when they thawed, and the whistle would return. That night, lying in bed under 4 blankets, she heard the roof creak. Not the creak of settling, the creak of weight, of accumulation, of snow pressing down on 31-year-old joints and 31-year-old nails and 31-year-old wood that had been good wood once, but was now tired wood the way everything gets tired when it has held the same weight long enough. She thought of the circle on the hillside, 40 feet across, dug into the earth below the frost line, below the wind, below the snow. No roof to creak, no walls to crack, no chinking to crumble. Just earth holding its steady 52 degrees while the world above screamed itself white. She thought of the thermometer on the wall, Ansel's one concession to precision in a life otherwise governed by instinct. A brass-cased instrument German made that he had ordered from a catalogue in 1890 and hung beside the door with a carpenter's care. It read, 14 degrees outside. 14 above zero on the 3rd of November, 3 weeks early, with the real cold still months away. She thought of her notebook, the patterns. 1888. She thought of Peder's folder on the kitchen table under the jar of yarrow. And then she stopped thinking about the folder and started thinking about the hillside, the slope, the soil composition, the angle of the prevailing wind, the location of the nearest timber, the length of a tunnel, the diameter of a room. She thought with the careful sequential precision of a woman who had planned and executed 22 years of ranch operations without help, without error, without ever once asking permission. By morning, she had a plan, not on paper, in her head. Dorrit Skaale did not put plans on paper until she had built them once in her mind and tested them against every failure she could imagine. She had imagined 6 failures during the night. She had solved 4 and accepted 2 as risks worth taking. She ate breakfast. Oatmeal, elk jerky, black coffee. She dressed in Ansel's canvas coat because it was warmer than hers, and she no longer cared about fit. She loaded the wagon with her 2 best shovels, a pickaxe, a handsaw, a coil of rope, and the leather notebook with 20 years of weather in it. She drove to the hillside. The circle was dusted with snow. The ancient post stubs wore little white caps. She stood at the edge and looked at the shape of it, the way it sat into the slope, the way the terrain above it curved to shed water and wind to either side. Whoever had built this had chosen the spot with an intelligence that Dorrit recognized, because it was the same intelligence she used when choosing where to set fence posts and where to dig wells. You didn't fight the land, you read it. You found the place where the land was already doing most of the work, and you built there. She drove the pickaxe into the slope 30 feet south of the old circle. The ground gave easily for the first 10 inches, then hardened. Clay. Dense tan speckled with gravel. Good. Clay held form. Clay held heat. Clay did not crumble the way sandy soil crumbled, did not shift the way loam shifted. She swung again and again. By noon, she had carved a notch into the hillside roughly 8 feet wide and 2 feet deep, and the exposed clay wall at the back of the notch was cool to the touch, but not cold. Steady, patient. The earth beneath the frost line does not panic when the temperature drops. It simply waits, holding whatever warmth it has gathered, releasing it slowly the way a careful woman spends savings a little at a time, never all at once. She ate a lunch, sitting in the notch. She had dug her back against the clay wall, and the wall was warmer than the air by a margin she could feel through her coat. She wrote in her notebook, air 26 degrees, clay wall estimated 50. The differential was already significant, and she had only gone 2 feet in. The ground remembers. She did not write those words yet, but she felt them. On the second day of digging, she noticed a rider on the ridge above. Fenimore Goss, 63 years old, owner of the adjacent 320 acres, built like a rain barrel and twice as stubborn. He sat his horse and watched her work for a full 10 minutes before riding down. His horse was a sorrel mare with a bad hip that gave her a hitch in her step, and the hitch made a particular sound on frozen ground, a syncopated crunch that Dorrit could identify from 50 yards. Dorrit. She didn't look up. The pickaxe rose and fell. Clay chips flew. "What are you digging?" "A place to live." He leaned forward in his saddle, looked at the notch in the hillside, looked at the pile of excavated clay, looked at the ancient circle nearby, looked back at Dorrit, who was 58 years old, and swinging a pickaxe with the metronomic patience of a woman who understood that earth moves one strike at a time and not faster. "You're going to live in a hole in the ground." "I'm going to live in the ground. There's a difference." He let out a laugh. Not cruel exactly, startled. The laugh of a man confronted with something so far outside his experience that the only available response was the one the body offered automatically. Like a prairie dog or a ground squirrel. Dorrit stopped swinging. She straightened, looked at Fenimore with those November Creek eyes, steady and gray-green, and holding no anger because anger was a waste of the same energy she needed for the pickaxe. "Prairie dogs survive every winter. Their holes stay above freezing when it's 40 below outside. Can your cabin say the same?" Fenimore's laugh faded. He had lost 11 head of cattle in the winter of 1906, and his cabin walls held frost on the inside from December through February. And he burned 4 cords of wood every winter just to keep the main room above 50 degrees, and they both knew it. He rode away without answering. By evening, the news had traveled the valley, the way news always travels in small, isolated places, completely rapidly and with embellishment. Dorrit Skaale had lost her mind. Dorrit Skaale was digging a grave. Dorrit Skaale was building a root cellar big enough to live in, which was the same as admitting she couldn't maintain a proper house, which was the same as admitting she should have sold when Peder asked. The women at the Dubois General Store discussed it between purchases of flour and lard. The men at the blacksmith shop discussed it between shoes. Everyone agreed on 2 things. First, it was a shame about Ansel. Second, the widow would come to her senses when the ground froze too hard to dig. But the ground on that hillside 2 feet down does not freeze. That was the part they did not understand. That was the part Dorrit understood in her hands before she understood it in her words. Below the frost line, the earth keeps its own counsel. It holds 45 degrees, 50 degrees, 52 degrees, regardless of what the sky is doing, regardless of what the wind is screaming, regardless of what every rancher in the valley believes about the only right way to build a shelter. The ground does not argue. It does not explain itself. It simply holds what it holds for as long as anyone cares to notice. Dorrit noticed. She swung the pickaxe again. The clay gave way and the hillside opened, and the warmth from below rose to meet her like a hand extended in the dark. The 3rd week of November brought a second storm heavier than the first, and Dorrit worked through it. She had excavated a chamber 5 feet deep into the hillside and was beginning to widen it to its planned 16-foot diameter. The work was brutal and slow, and exactly the kind of work she had been doing her entire adult life, which is to say, work that hurt and mattered and would not be finished by wishing. Her shoulders ached in a way that woke her at 3 in the morning. Her hands cracked and bled where the pick handle wore the skin. She wrapped them in strips of flour sack and kept swinging. At night, she still slept in the cabin. At night, the cabin still leaked and whistled and creaked. But now, lying in the dark, she did not think about the sounds. She thought about the chamber in the hillside, about its silence, about the way the air inside it felt different from the air outside, heavier, somehow stiller, older, as if the space she was carving had always existed in potential, and she was simply revealing it the way water reveals the shape of a stream bed by flowing through it long enough. She thought about Josiah Whitehawk's one sentence: "The doorway faces east, always east." She had begun the entrance tunnel, angling it downward from the eastern face of the hill, pitching it at a grade of roughly 1 foot for every 6 feet of length. The low point of the tunnel would sit 3 feet below the floor of the main chamber. Cold air sinks. Everyone knows cold air sinks, but knowing a thing and building a thing that uses what you know are different acts entirely. And Dorrit was learning the difference with every shovelful of clay she removed. The tunnel was the key. She understood that now. Not the chamber, not the roof, not the walls. The tunnel. Because the tunnel was where the physics happened. Cold air from outside would enter the tunnel, sink to its lowest point, pooling there like water in a drain. The fire in the chamber above would warm the air, and warm air rises, and the rising air would exit through the smoke hole at the top, creating low pressure inside the chamber, which would pull fresh air in through the tunnel, but only the air that had already lost its worst cold to the tunnel's lowest bend. A convection loop, self-sustaining, elegant, ancient. She was not building a hole in the ground. She was building a machine. A machine that ran on physics and geometry, and the patient, inexhaustible warmth of the earth itself. On November the 28th, with the tunnel half dug and the chamber nearly at full width, she stopped for the day and walked back to the old Earth Lodge circle. The ancient posts, the dark soil, the hearthstone she had unearthed weeks ago. She knelt and placed both palms flat on the ground inside the circle, the way she had placed her palm on the fence post in September. And the ground was warm, steady, unchanged by the storm, unchanged by the snow, unchanged by the passage of however many decades or centuries since the last fire burned here. The ground remembers. She said it aloud this time. To no one. To the wind which carried it away. To the soil under her palms which had no need to hear what it already knew. She stood, walked back to her own excavation, picked up the shovel, and kept building. December came without permission. It arrived the way it always arrives in the Wind River Basin, not as a date on a calendar, but as a change in the quality of silence. The birds stopped. The creek slowed to a whisper under a skin of ice. The air itself thickened, as though the valley were holding its breath before something terrible. Dorrit did not stop digging. The chamber had reached its full diameter, 16 feet across, 5.5 feet deep at the center, carved into the south-facing slope of the hill, with its floor sitting comfortably below the frost line. The walls were clay smooth where she had packed them with the flat of the shovel, and they held a faint sheen in lantern light that made the space look almost like the inside of a vessel, a jar something made to contain. The entrance tunnel stretched 18 feet from the eastern face of the hill, angled downward narrow enough that she had to duck and turn sideways at its tightest point. The lowest point of the tunnel sat 3 feet below the chamber floor, exactly as planned, exactly as physics required. But the roof was the problem. The roof had been the problem for 9 days. She had felled 6 cottonwood poles from the river bottom, each roughly 8 inches in diameter and reasonably straight. Getting them up the hill had taken 2 days with the horse and a drag chain, and the horse had opinions about every foot of the incline. The center post was the heaviest, 12 feet long, thick as a man's thigh, and she had wrestled it into the hole she had dug at the chamber's center. The way a person wrestles anything too heavy for one body with leverage, profanity, and a refusal to accept the arithmetic of the situation. It stood now slightly off-plumb, braced with rocks at its base, holding nothing yet. The problem was the radial beams. 4 of them needed to run from the center post to the chamber walls, forming the skeleton of a conical roof. Each beam was 10 feet long and needed to be notched at both ends, fitted to the center post at an angle of roughly 30 degrees, and secured well enough to bear the weight of everything that would go on top. Dorrit had notched wood before. She had not notched wood at a 30-degree angle while standing in a 5-foot-deep hole with a handsaw that was losing its set. The first beam she cut was too short by 4 inches. The notch was too shallow. When she levered it into position, it slipped and fell and struck her across the left shoulder with enough force to sit her down in the clay. She sat there for a while. The shoulder throbbed. Above her, through the open roof, the sky was the color of pewter, and a single hawk circled in a gyre so wide and slow it seemed motionless. She got up, cut another beam. This one she measured twice, holding a length of baling wire from center post to wall as a guide. The notch she cut, deeper angled, more aggressively tested with the heel of her hand before committing. It fit. Not perfectly, there was a gap on the underside she would need to shim, but it fit and it held. And when she hung her weight on it, the center post groaned, but did not shift. 1 beam, 3 more to go. The second beam went up faster. By the third, she had developed a rhythm measure with wire mark with charcoal. Cut the notch in 3 passes. Rough shaping final lever into position using a forked branch as a prop. Secure with pegs whittled from cottonwood scraps. The 4th beam split when she drove the peg. She stared at the split for a long time, then walked back to the river bottom and cut another pole and dragged it up the hill alone because the horse had stepped on a sharp stone that morning and was favoring its right foreleg. By the 10th of December, the 4 radial beams were in place and the skeleton of the roof was complete. She stood outside the chamber and looked at it from above. It looked like the rib cage of some enormous animal half buried in the hillside bones, pointing skyward, waiting for flesh. The flesh came next. Willow branches cut from the thickets along the creek, stripped of leaves, still green enough to bend without snapping. She wove them between the radial beams in a lattice pattern, each branch overlapping the next, by a hand's width tied at the intersections with strips of wet rawhide that would shrink as they dried and pull the joints tight. This was the work she was best at. This was the work that most resembled the ranch work she had done for 2 decades, repetitive, physical, rhythmic, demanding attention, without demanding thought, leaving the mind free to listen to the wind and the creak of the wood, and the steady small sounds of a structure becoming itself. Over the willow lattice, she laid hay, not loose packed in thick mats she had prepared in October. Each mat roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, compressed and tied with twine. She shingled them from the bottom up the way a roofer shingles, so each mat overlapped the one below, and water would run down rather than through. The hay was 14 inches thick at the edges and 18 inches thick at the crown. On top of the hay, she shoveled clay, 12 inches of dense wet clay packed by hand, smoothed with the back of the shovel. The clay would freeze on the surface and seal. Snow would cover the clay and add another layer of insulation. By midwinter, the roof would be earth hay willow and air 4 layers between the interior and the sky, each layer doing a different job, each job essential. She left an opening at the crown, 8 inches in diameter, the smoke hole. She fashioned a cap from a flat piece of cottonwood bark hinged with rawhide that could be opened to vent smoke and closed to retain heat. The hinge was clumsy, the bark warped when it dried, and did not seat flush, but it worked well enough to control the draw. 12 days of construction. Her hands were cracked in 14 places. She could feel every one of them when she gripped the shovel. Small bright lines of pain that mapped the cost of the work on her body. She did not bandage them anymore. The blood dried, and the cracks sealed with clay dust, and the combination formed a kind of rough plaster that held until the next morning's washing. On the 13th of December, the rain came back. Not the autumn rain of October. A winter rain, colder, heavier, driven by a south wind that had no business blowing south in December, but blew anyway as if the weather had forgotten its own rules. The rain fell for 3 days. It fell on the cabin. It fell on the pasture. It fell on the hillside where the earth lodge sat half-finished. Its clay roof still uncured, its tunnel still unlined. Dorrit watched from the cabin window. She could not work in this rain. The clay would be too wet to pack the tunnel, too slick to navigate safely. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and drew diagrams. The entrance tunnel needed a floor. She had planned to line it with flat stones from the creek bed, but she had not yet collected them. And now the creek was swollen and brown and angry. She revised. Pine planks from the barn laid lengthwise shimmered level with clay. Not as durable as stone, but faster to install and available immediately. She could replace them with stone in the spring. On the fourth morning, the rain stopped. She dressed before dawn and rode to the hillside. The damage was visible from 50 yards. The entrance tunnel had collapsed, not entirely. The inner two-thirds still held where the clay was denser and the hillside thicker above it. But the outer 6 feet where the tunnel emerged from the face of the hill had caved inward. The roof of the tunnel had sagged, then broken, and a wedge of sodden earth had slumped into the passage, filling it to a height of 3 feet. The opening was gone. Where it had been, there was now a ragged slope of wet clay and dead grass steaming faintly in the cold air. She stood at the edge of the collapse and did not move for a long time. The steam rose. A magpie called from somewhere behind her, the same hard mechanical sound that magpies have made in this valley for 1,000 years. The chamber itself was intact. She could see that from the smoke hole the interior was undisturbed. The center post still plumbed, the radial beam still holding. But the only way in was through the tunnel, and the tunnel was blocked, and the only way to unblock it was to dig it out by hand, and then reinforce it with something stronger than raw clay. She climbed to the smoke hole and lowered herself through it, dropped to the chamber floor. The space was dark, damp, and very still. She could smell the earth, not the surface smell of soil and roots, but the deeper smell, mineral and cool, the smell of time compressed into matter. She lit the lantern she had left hanging from the center post. The walls glowed amber. The air was warm. She walked to where the tunnel met the chamber. The collapse had stopped at the threshold the chamber's wider span and thicker overhead had held. She could see the plug of fallen earth filling the tunnel, a solid wall of wet clay sealing her in. For a moment, standing in that circle of lantern light with the earth closed around her, on every side she felt something she had not felt since the night Ansel's horse came home without him. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The recognition that she was alone and that the distance between her and the rest of the world was measured not in miles, but in feet of packed clay, and that no one knew she was here, and that if the chamber collapsed the way the tunnel had collapsed, the valley would not find her until spring, if then. She picked up the shovel she had left leaning against the wall. She began to dig toward the light. It took 4 hours of shoveling wet clay in a space too narrow to swing properly, passing the loaded shovel behind her and dumping it in the chamber, then turning back to the face and cutting another slice. The clay was heavy. Each shovelful weighed 8 or 9 pounds, and there were hundreds of shovelfuls between her and the outside air. Her arms burned. Her lower back seized twice, locking her in a half-bent position that she broke by pressing her spine against the tunnel wall and pushing until something released with a sound she felt more than heard. Halfway through, she stopped, leaned against the tunnel wall, breathed. The air was thick with the smell of turned earth and her own sweat. She thought about the folder on the kitchen table. $1,200. Heated rooms in Casper. A doctor within walking distance. She thought about those things the way a drowning person thinks about shore, not as a plan, but as a fact, bright and simple and impossibly far away. Then she thought about the thermometer. 52 degrees inside this tunnel, even now, even with the collapse, even with the rain. 52 degrees when the air outside was 29 and falling. The earth was holding its warmth. The way it had always held its warmth, indifferent to the disaster above, indifferent to her doubt, indifferent to everything except the slow geological patience of matter, doing what matter does. She picked up the shovel. She dug. When she broke through the light, hit her face like cold water. She crawled out of the tunnel on her hands and knees into air that was sharp and clean, 26 degrees. And she sat in the snow at the mouth of the collapsed entrance and shook, not from cold, from the effort of not stopping, from the particular exhaustion of a person who has talked themselves out of quitting by talking themselves into the next shovelful and the next, until there were no more shovelfuls left. She sat there for 10 minutes. Then she stood up and began planning the reinforcement. The tunnel would need a frame. She cut lodgepole pine from the stand behind the ridge, slim trunks 4 inches in diameter, straight, grained, easy to split. She built a box frame, 2 vertical posts on each side, a crossbeam on top, spaced every 3 feet along the tunnel's length. Between the frames, she packed clay, ramming it hard with a length of post until it rang. The frame tunnel was narrower than the original, barely wide enough for her shoulders. But it was rigid, and when she pressed her palm against the crossbeam and pushed, nothing moved, nothing gave. The earth above the frame might shift again, but the frame would hold it, and the passage would stay open. It took 5 days. 5 days she did not have because December in the Wind River Basin does not wait for construction schedules. But she took them anyway because a shelter with no entrance is not a shelter. It is a grave. On the 22nd of December, a buckboard pulled up to the ranch gate. Dorrit Skaale climbed down from one side. From the other, a girl dropped to the ground with the careless agility of someone who has not yet learned that the body has limits. Dorrit Skaale, 14 years old, brown hair pulled back with a ribbon that was already coming undone. A satchel over one shoulder, heavy enough to make her list sideways. Dorrit had not expected them. Dorrit explained from the gate, not coming in engine, idling. His voice carrying the particular tightness of a man delivering a package he hopes will do the persuading. He could not. Christmas break, 2 weeks. She wanted to see the ranch. The wanted carried weight. Dorrit heard it. Kala had not wanted to see the ranch. Kala had been sent to see the ranch and to see her grandmother living alone on it, and to form the impressions that Dorrit hoped would align with his argument for selling. The girl was a weapon deployed gently, but a weapon nonetheless. Kala stood at the gate and looked at everything with the wide, consuming gaze of a person seeing a place for the first time and not knowing yet which details matter. Her eyes moved from the cabin to the barn, to the corral, to the ridge, to the sky, and back to Dorrit, who stood on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hand. "Hi, Grandma." "Kala, come inside. Your father can go." Dorrit left. The buckboard rattled down the road. Kala carried her satchel into the cabin and set it on the bed in the small room that had been Dorrit's, and looked around with the air of someone cataloging a museum exhibit. She touched the yarrow in the jar. She touched the thermometer on the wall. She opened the notebook on the table and read 3 pages of weather data before Dorrit gently closed it. "What's this?" Kala pointed at the diagram Dorrit had drawn the night before, a cross-section of the earth lodge with the tunnel, the chamber, the smoke hole, and arrows indicating airflow. "Something I'm building." "What is it?" Dorrit hesitated. She had not explained the lodge to anyone. Josiah had understood without explanation. Fenimore had not understood even with it. Dorrit would not have listened long enough to need either. But Kala was looking at the diagram with her head tilted and her eyes tracking the arrows the way a person tracks a river, on a map following the flow, and the question she had asked was not polite curiosity. It was the question of someone who genuinely did not know and genuinely wanted to. "Put your coat back on." They walked to the hillside. Kala saw the mound of excavated clay, the reinforced tunnel entrance, the faint wisp of warmth rising from the smoke hole. She walked a full circle around the structure without being told to. She knelt at the tunnel entrance and peered into the dark passage. "You built this." "I dug it. The building isn't finished." "Why down? Why not up?" The question was so clean and so fundamental that Dorrit paused. She had answered it for herself in physics, in observation, in 20 years of weather data, and the evidence of an ancient circle in the ground. But Kala was 14, and 14 does not need physics. 14 needs the answer that makes sense in the body. Put your hand on the ground. Kala pressed her bare palm into the exposed clay wall at the tunnel entrance. Her eyes changed. It's warm. It's always warm. 2 feet down, the earth stays above 50 degrees all winter. The air above can be 40 below, but the ground holds what it holds. A cabin fights the cold from the outside. This works with the warmth from below. Kala pulled a notebook from her satchel. Not the kind of notebook Dorrit kept. Not a ledger, not a record, but a school composition book. The kind with a marbled black and white cover and lined pages. She opened it and began to write. She wrote quickly in a hand that leaned hard to the right, and she did not ask permission to write. What are the dimensions? Dorrit told her. 16 feet across, 5.5 deep, tunnel 18 feet long, lowest point 3 feet below the chamber floor. Smoke hole 8 inches. Roof composition willow lattice, 14 to 18 inches of hay, 12 inches of clay. Kala wrote it all. Over the next 4 days, Kala became Dorrit's shadow on the hillside. She carried tools, she hauled clay in buckets, she asked questions with a persistence that was exhausting. And Dorrit realized on the 3rd day, invaluable, because the questions forced Dorrit to articulate what she had understood intuitively. Why does the tunnel slope downward? Because cold air is denser and sinks to the lowest point. Why face the entrance east? Because the prevailing winter wind comes from the northwest and an east-facing entrance stays in the hill's wind shadow. Why clay and not timber for the walls? Because clay absorbs heat from the fire and radiates it back for hours after the fire dies, while timber reflects heat momentarily and loses it immediately. Each answer spoken aloud became more real. Each answer written in Kala's tilting hand became permanent. On the 26th of December, Dorrit lit the first fire. She had built a hearth ring from creek stones set directly on the chamber floor at the center, 6 inches from the base of the center post. The stones were flat dents chosen for their thermal mass, the kind of stone that drinks heat and gives it back slowly. She laid a small fire of cottonwood splits no bigger than a man's 2 fists and struck a match. The flame caught. Smoke curled upward, found the smoke hole and threaded through it into the December sky. The draw was immediate and clean. The low-pressure zone created by the rising warm air pulled fresh air in through the tunnel with a soft, steady whisper that sounded almost like breathing. The chamber had lungs. Dorrit had given it lungs, and it was breathing. She sat on the chamber floor. Kala sat beside her. They watched the fire and did not speak. The walls began to change. Not visibly, the change was thermal, invisible, gradual. The clay was absorbing the fire's heat molecule by molecule, storing it in its dense, patient structure. Dorrit placed her palm on the wall 3 feet from the fire. Cool. She waited. 15 minutes later, she placed her palm again. Warm, not hot, not dramatic. Just warm the way a body is warm, the way the earth 2 feet down is warm. A quiet, persistent declaration of temperature. An hour passed. She let the fire die to coals. The chamber should have cooled. In a cabin, it would have cooled. In a cabin, the moment the fire dies, the cold begins its advance through the walls, through the gaps, through every crack and joint and failed piece of chinking. And within an hour, the room is the same temperature as the world outside. The chamber did not cool. 2 hours after the fire died, the walls were still warm. The air inside was still warm. Dorrit unwound the scarf from her neck. 4 hours, still warm. Kala had fallen asleep against the wall, her composition book open on her lap, her pen still in her hand. 6 hours. Dorrit took down the thermometer from the center post where she had hung it that morning. She read it twice because the first reading seemed wrong, and then she read it a 3rd time because the second reading confirmed the first, and she wanted to be certain. 52 degrees Fahrenheit, inside the chamber, 6 hours after the last flame. She opened the smoke hole cap and looked out. The sky was black with stars. The kind of stars you only see when the air is so cold. It has squeezed all the moisture from itself and become glass. She could not see the thermometer on the cabin porch from here, but she did not need to. She knew. Her notebook knew. Her 20 years of data knew. Minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside. 63 degrees of difference. A small fire cottonwood splits no bigger than 2 fists. Burned for 1 hour. And 6 hours later, the earth was still giving back what it had taken, and still radiating, still holding the way it has held warmth, since before anyone built anything on its surface. The way it held warmth for the people who built the circle 40 feet to the north centuries ago, whose names no one remembers, but whose engineering was so sound that the shape of their home is still legible in the ground. She reached for the notebook. Her hand was not shaking, but it moved with a care that suggested she understood the weight of what she was recording. She wrote the date, the time, the interior temperature, the estimated exterior temperature, the fire size, the duration since last flame, and then below the numbers she wrote 3 words she had been carrying inside her chest since September. 3 words that had started as a feeling in her palm on a warm fence post and had grown into a principle and were now, with the evidence cooling around her, a fact. The ground remembers. Skaale stirred, opened her eyes, saw Dorrit writing, and leaned over to read. Without asking, she opened her own composition book to a fresh page and copied the 3 words in her tilting rightward hand. Below them, she added her own notation. Interior temp 52 degrees Fahrenheit, exterior est minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit differential, 63 degrees Fahrenheit, fire out 6 hours. She underlined the 63 twice. They climbed out through the tunnel into a night so cold the air felt like it had edges. The stars were savage overhead. The snow squeaked under their boots, that high thin sound that only happens below zero. They walked to the cabin, opened the door. The cabin was 41 degrees inside. The fire in the fireplace had been banked that morning and was now a bed of grey ash giving off no heat at all. Skaale looked at her grandmother. Dorrit looked at the cabin. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the hole in the hillside, the place the valley laughed about, the prairie dog den. The ground squirrel burrow was 11 degrees warmer than the cabin that a competent man had built with milled lumber and iron nails 31 years ago. Dorrit rebuilt the fire. They ate supper. They did not talk about the lodge. They did not need to. The numbers had said everything, and the numbers were in 2 notebooks now instead of 1. The next morning, she heard the crunch, the syncopated crunch of a horse with a bad hip on frozen ground. She was at the tunnel entrance fitting the last section of pine plank flooring when Fenimore Goss rode up the hill. He did not stop at a distance this time. He rode all the way to the entrance and dismounted and stood there looking at the mound of earth that was the roof, at the thin line of smoke threading from the smoke hole at the narrow tunnel disappearing into the hill. "You finished it." "Mostly." He stood for a long time. His breath came in white plumes. His mustache was frosted. "Can I see?" Dorrit stepped aside. Fenimore ducked into the tunnel. She heard him shuffling through the narrow passage, heard his grunt as he emerged into the chamber, heard silence. She waited outside. The wind blew. A raven crossed the sky in a straight black line. When he came out, his face was different. Not humble exactly. Fenimore Goss would never wear humble the way a natural expression sits on a face. But something had shifted behind his eyes, the way something shifts when a person encounters evidence that contradicts a belief they have held so long it has become part of their skeleton. "It's warm in there. 52 degrees this morning. The fire, been out since last night." He processed this. She watched him process it. Watched the number travel from his ears to his brain. Watched it collide with everything he knew about winter and heating and wood, and loss watched the collision produce not understanding. Not yet, but the beginning of a question he had never thought to ask. Wait for the real storm. His voice had no laughter in it now, no mockery. just the flat, careful tone of a man who is not ready to believe but is no longer able to disbelieve. Wait for 40 below and wind for 3 days straight, and then tell me. Dorrit nodded. She was waiting for exactly that. She had been waiting for it since September, since her notebook told her it was coming, since she pressed her palm to a warm fence post and felt the earth offering an answer to a question the rest of the valley hadn't thought to ask. On the 30th of December, the sky turned the color of iron. The barometric pressure dropped so fast that the horses grew restless, and the cattle bunched tight against the south fence and would not eat. The wind shifted northwest. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero, began to fall, not gradually, not gently, but with the steady, mechanical inevitability of something heavy sliding down a slope. Dorrit stood at the cabin window and watched the sky seal itself shut. She looked at the thermometer. 4 degrees above zero at noon. By 3, it was 6 below. By sunset, the mercury had retreated past 10 below and was still falling, pulling away from the numbers like a creature retreating into its burrow. She packed the things she would need: blankets, the coffee pot, jerky flour lard, matches, the lantern, the thermometer from the wall. Ansel's thermometer unscrewed from its bracket for the first time in 21 years. The notebook. She loaded everything into a canvas sack, put on Ansel's coat, and walked through the gathering dark to the hillside. She ducked into the tunnel, crawled through the narrow passage, emerged into the chamber, lit the lantern, built a fire, hung the thermometer on the center post. Kala was already there. She had carried her satchel and her composition book and a wool blanket and a jar of preserved peaches from the pantry. She was sitting cross-legged on the chamber floor, writing, and she did not look up when Dorrit came in. "I brought peaches." "Good." Outside, the storm that had been building for 3 days finally broke. They could not hear it. That was the first thing Dorrit noticed, and it was the thing that changed everything she understood about shelter. In the cabin, a storm was an assault wind tearing at the walls, snow hissing against the windows, the roof groaning, the draft shrieking through the fireplace crack. The storm was always inside the cabin, as much as outside it, present in every sound and every cold current and every flicker of the candle. Here there was nothing. The earth absorbed the storm the way it absorbed everything else, silently, completely, without complaint. Dorrit knew the wind was blowing because she had seen the sky. She knew the temperature was plummeting because she had watched the mercury. But inside the chamber, sitting on the floor, with her back against a wall that radiated 52 degrees of patient geological warmth, she could not feel any of it. The fire crackled, the lantern hissed. Kala's pen scratched across the page. That was all. "The ground remembers what we build into it." Dorrit thought the words but did not say them. Not yet. Not until the storm had finished its argument, and the earth had finished its reply. She pulled Ansel's coat tighter, though she did not need it, and watched the fire, and waited for whatever was coming next. The storm lasted 5 days. Not 5 days the way people in milder places count storms, where a day of heavy snow is followed by a day of lighter snow, and the whole thing is called 2 days because the calendar turned. 5 days of unbroken wind. 5 days of temperatures that did not rise above 30 below. 5 days during which the Wind River Basin ceased to be a place where anything lived and became instead a white howling void where the difference between sky and ground disappeared entirely, and the only direction that existed was whatever direction the wind was pushing. On the second day, 3 of Fenimore Goss's cattle froze standing up. He found them in the morning like statues, legs locked, heads bowed, ice in their nostrils. He could not move them. He could not dig graves. He left them where they stood and went back to his cabin, where the fire he had been feeding every 2 hours since midnight was losing its war against the draft coming through the north wall. On the third day, the mercury in his kitchen thermometer sank past 30 below and kept going. 32 below, 35. At 38 below zero, Fenimore Goss did something he had not done in 63 years of living. He admitted he was wrong, and he acted on it. Dorrit heard the knocking at the tunnel entrance just after noon. though noon was indistinguishable from any other hour because the smoke hole showed nothing but white. The knocking was not loud. It was the sound of knuckles that had lost most of their feeling striking wood that was frozen too hard to resonate. She crawled through the tunnel and found him at the entrance still mounted, because dismounting required fine motor control, and his hands had stopped providing it half a mile ago. His face was the color of a bruise, purple-red across the cheeks, white at the nose and earlobes, the early geometry of frostbite mapping itself onto his skin. The sorrel mare with the bad hip stood with her head down, ice-crusted along her mane, trembling. Dorrit did not ask why he had come. The answer was visible in every line of his body. "Get down. Give me your hand." He half fell from the saddle. She led the mare to the lee side of the hill, where the wind broke against the slope and created a pocket of relative calm, and tied her to the post she had set there for her own horse. She covered the mare with the wool blanket she kept in the tunnel entrance. Then she took Fenimore by the arm and guided him into the passage. He could barely fit. His shoulders scraped both walls. He moved on his knees, one hand on the floor planks, the other pressed against the tunnel wall, and she heard him inhale sharply when his palm touched the clay. Not from cold, but from warmth. The tunnel was 48 degrees. He had come from 38 below. The differential was 86 degrees, and it hit his nervous system like a drug. She heard him make a sound he probably did not know he was making, a low involuntary exhale, the sound of a body releasing a tension it had been holding for 3 days. He emerged into the chamber and stood up. Dorrit watched his face. She watched the information travel from his skin to his eyes, to whatever part of the brain builds models of how the world works. The fire was burning low in the hearth ring, just coals barely aflame, and the chamber was 54 degrees. He was standing in a room carved from the earth, buried under snow, invisible from the surface, and it was 54 degrees without any meaningful fire. He sat down on the floor. He did not choose where to sit. His legs simply stopped working, and he sat where they put him. His hands hung between his knees. Ice melted from his mustache and dripped onto his coat. Skaale, who was sitting against the far wall with her composition book, watched him with the frank, unblinking attention of 14. 10 minutes passed. The fire popped. A coal shifted. Somewhere above them, 60-mile-per-hour winds were stripping the valley bare. But here the only sound was the soft rhythmic whisper of air moving through the tunnel. The convection loop pulling fresh air in, warming it as it rose through the passage, delivering it to the chamber at a temperature the human body could survive. Fenimore spoke without lifting his head. "I was wrong." Dorrit poured him coffee from the pot she kept warm on the hearthstones. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence, which was the silence of a man revising a lifetime of assumptions in real time. And that kind of revision needs space, not commentary. He wrapped his hands around the tin cup. The heat from the coffee and the heat from the chamber were working on him now, pulling the color back into his fingers, pulling the tremor out of his shoulders. He drank. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling, the lattice of willow visible between the radial beams, holding the hay, holding the clay, holding the earth that held the warmth. He looked at the smoke hole where the thin column of warm air rose into the storm and vanished. "Henderson's roof came down last night. He's in his barn with the horses." Dorrit nodded. The Henderson place was 4 miles north, closer to the river, more exposed. The cabin had been poorly built to begin with. "My north wall split at the chinking. I can't keep the main room above 15 degrees. 15 degrees inside, with 4 cords of wood burning." Dorrit thought about her own cabin, 41 degrees with a banked fire, and thought about this chamber, 54 degrees with nothing but coals. The arithmetic was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was the kind of arithmetic that ends arguments. That night, the 3 of them sat around the hearth ring, and Dorrit fed the fire just enough to keep a low-flame cottonwood splits broken to the length of her forearm, laid in a teepee, no bigger than a bread loaf. The walls did the rest. They had been absorbing heat for days now. The clay saturated with thermal energy, and they radiated it back into the chamber with the steady, imperceptible patience of something that does not know how to hurry. The temperature held at 54 degrees. Dorrit took off Ansel's coat and hung it on a peg she had driven into the center post. Fenimore stared at her. "You're warm enough to take off your coat." "I've been warm enough to take off my coat since I moved in." He looked at the coat on the peg. He looked at the walls. He looked at the fire that was barely a fire. Something in his expression shifted again. Not the shock of the first hour, but something quieter, something closer to grief. The grief of a man who understands that he has spent 30 winters burning 4 cords of wood a year to maintain 15 degrees inside a structure that was never designed to work with the landscape it sat on. 30 winters of fighting. And here was a woman who had stopped fighting and started listening, and the earth had answered. On the 5th day, the wind died. It did not taper or fade. It stopped the way a held breath stops all at once, leaving behind a silence so total that Dorrit could hear her own heartbeat and the tick of ice crystals settling on the roof above her. She climbed to the smoke hole and pushed the cap open and looked out. The valley was white. Not the white of fresh snow, which has texture and shadow and movement. The white of aftermath. A flat, depthless, absolute white that erased fences and roads and creek beds and every human mark on the land. The sky above was blue in a way that seemed aggressive, as if the atmosphere were compensating for 5 days of fury with a display of innocence so vivid it was almost insulting. The temperature by the thermometer she lifted through the smoke hole was 22 below, warmer than it had been, still lethal but warmer. She heard a sound from the valley floor, an engine, then hooves, then a voice she recognized calling her name with a particular pitch of controlled panic that told her everything about what Pedro Skaale expected to find when he reached the ranch. He found the cabin first. The cabin was standing but damaged. The roof had shed its snow load unevenly, and the ridge beam had bowed, and the door was frozen shut. And when he kicked it open, the interior was 14 degrees, and the fireplace crack had widened to the width of his thumb. The kitchen table was bare except for the folder from Fremont Consolidated still under the jar of dried yarrow, both covered in a thin film of frost. The bed was made. The thermometer bracket on the wall was empty. He ran, not toward the barn, which was the logical second place to look, but toward the hillside. He had heard his mother describe the lodge. He had dismissed the description the way he dismissed most of what she told him about the ranch, with the distracted courtesy of a man who believes he already knows the answer. But now the cabin was 14 degrees, and his mother was not in it, and the only other structure on the property was a hole in the ground that he had privately considered evidence of her declining judgment. He saw the smoke first, a thread of it rising from the hillside, thin and straight in the still air. He ran to it, found the tunnel entrance, ducked inside. 18 feet of narrow passage, pine-planked floor. Clay walls radiating warmth. He crawled through it with his coat scraping the ceiling, and his breath loud in the confined space, and he emerged into the chamber and stood up and found his mother sitting on the floor knitting. Kala was beside her reading a book she had brought from Casper, her back against the wall, her coat folded under her as a cushion. Fenimore Goss was on the far side of the hearth, drinking coffee from a tin cup, looking more at ease than Pedro had ever seen the man look. The fire was small, the room was warm, the air smelled like wood smoke and coffee and earth. The deep mineral smell of clay that has been heated and cooled and heated again until it carries the scent of its own warmth. Pedro stood in the entrance to the chamber. He did not sit down. He did not speak. He looked at the walls. He looked at the roof. He looked at the thermometer hanging from the center post, which read 53 degrees. He looked at his mother's hands, steady on the knitting needles, and at the coat she was not wearing because she did not need it, and at the peg where it hung, and at the center post that held the peg, and at the radial beams that spread from the post to the walls, and at the willow lattice between the beams, and at the hay beyond the lattice, and at the earth beyond the hay, and at the snow beyond the earth, and at the storm beyond the snow, and at the fact plain and undeniable that his 58-year-old mother had built a structure from dirt and dead wood and ancient knowledge that had just survived effortlessly the worst 5 days the Wind River Basin had produced in 24 years. He sat down. He sat down the way Fenimore had sat down 5 days earlier, not by choice but by surrender. And the surrender was not to his mother, but to the evidence which was irrefutable, which was 53 degrees. No one mentioned the folder on the kitchen table. No one would mention it again. That evening, Peder asked. The question had been building in him all afternoon, visible in the way he kept looking at the walls. The tunnel, the smoke hole, as if searching for the trick. The hidden mechanism, the thing that would make this make sense within the framework of the world as he understood it. Where did you learn this? Dorrit was quiet for a moment. She looked at the wall nearest to her, where the clay still bore the marks of her shovel, and then past the wall through the earth toward the circle 40 feet north that she could not see but that she knew was there. The way she knew the sun was above the snow. From the people who lived here before us, they built a lodge on this hillside. I don't know how many years ago, 100, maybe more. The rain uncovered it last October, and I walked over the shape of it, and I understood what it was because the ground still held the form. Josiah Whitehawk told me the doorway faces east. That was all he said. The rest, the earth lodge itself taught me the depth, the angle, the way the tunnel traps the cold. They knew something we forgot. They knew how to let the ground do the work. The chamber was quiet. The fire murmured. Somewhere above them, the stars were coming out fierce and white in the clearing sky, and the temperature was dropping again, and none of it mattered down here. Kala closed her book. She had been listening without appearing to listen the way 14-year-olds listen when they sense that the conversation has crossed into territory that will matter to them for longer than the evening. She did not look at anyone. She looked at her composition book lying open on her lap, filled with measurements and diagrams and temperatures and the 3 words her grandmother had written on the 26th of December. I wrote it all down, everything, the dimensions, the angles, the temperatures, the way the tunnel works, all of it. She said it's simply the way a person states a fact they do not yet know the weight of. She was 14. She did not understand that knowledge can die in a single generation, that the people who built the circle on the hillside had known everything Dorrit had spent 3 months rediscovering, and that their knowledge had vanished, not because it was wrong, but because no one wrote it down. No one carried it forward. No one thought it was worth preserving against the day when someone would need it again. But Dorrit understood. She looked at her granddaughter and saw the composition book and saw the tilting handwriting and saw in that handwriting the thing she had been most afraid of losing. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not the cabin or the land or even her own life. The knowledge. The understanding that the earth holds warmth, and the tunnel traps cold, and the fire does not need to be large if the structure is wise. The understanding that you do not survive by fighting the winter. You survive by going where the winter cannot reach. The ground remembers, and now so do we. Spring came late that year, as it always does after the worst winters, as if the valley needs extra time to recover from what it has endured. The snow retreated up the hills in March, revealing the brown grass beneath, and the creek broke its ice in April. And by May, the columbines were up on the south slope where Ansel lay purple and blue against the new green. Dorrit did not move back to the cabin. She repaired it, patched the roof, repointed the chinking, sealed the fireplace crack with a proper mortar. But she slept in the lodge through the spring and into the summer, because even in warm weather, the chamber held a coolness that the cabin could not match. And because she had grown accustomed to the silence underground, to the smell of the earth, to the way the walls curved around her like cupped hands. Fenimore Goss came by in June. He brought a sack of flour and a question he had been carrying since January. He asked it standing at the tunnel entrance, hat in his hands. Would you show me how to build one? She did. 1967, July. A woman of 70 stands on a hillside in the Wind River Basin, holding a composition book with a marbled black and white cover. The book is 55 years old. The pages are brittle at the edges and the color of weak tea. The handwriting inside leans hard to the right, the handwriting of a girl who pressed too hard on the pen because she did not yet know that some things require a light touch. Dorrit Skaale, Kala Murray now for 41 years. Though she has kept the composition book under her maiden name, in her mind stands where the lodge used to be. The structure collapsed sometime in the 1940s after Dorrit died, and the ranch passed to Peder. And Peder sold it not to the mining company, but to a young couple from Thermopolis, who ran cattle on it for a decade before moving to Oregon. The lodge was never repaired. The tunnel filled with silt. The roof beams rotted, and the clay sank and the willow lattice returned to the soil it came from. What remains is a shallow depression in the hillside circular roughly 16 feet across. A trained eye would recognize it. An untrained eye would walk over it and see nothing. 40 feet to the north, the ancient Earth Lodge circle is still visible. Fainter now, the edges softened by 56 more years of wind and rain and sage encroachment. But the depression is there. The darker soil is there. The shape is there, pressed into the hillside like a thumbprint in wet clay, legible after centuries because the ground holds form the way it holds warmth, slowly, quietly, without asking for recognition. Kala opens the composition book. The pages crackle. She reads aloud to no one, to the wind, to the valley which is golden in the July light and smells of sage and warm dust. She reads the dimensions: 16 feet across, 5.5 deep. Tunnel 18 feet, lowest point 3 feet below. She reads the temperatures: 52 degrees inside, -11 outside, 63 degrees of differential. She reads the description of the convection loop, the thermal mass of clay, the function of the hay layer, the reason the door faces east. Her voice is steady. Her voice is the voice of a woman who has carried these numbers for 55 years and has never once doubted their accuracy, because she measured them herself in a chamber her grandmother built with 2 shovels and a pickaxe, and the memory of people whose names she never learned. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that is not hers, in handwriting that is smaller and steadier, and written with the careful pressure of a woman who understood that some sentences need to last 3 lines. The ground remembers what we build into it. Build gently. Kala closes the book. The wind moves through the valley, bending the sage, carrying the smell of dust and distance. She looks at the 2 circles in the ground, one ancient one, her grandmother's, and sees in their paired depressions the shape of a conversation that has been happening for centuries, spoken in earth, and silence between people who understood that the most durable architecture is not the kind that rises highest, but the kind that settles deepest. She puts the book in her bag. She walks down the hill. The circles remain, holding their shapes, holding their warmth, holding the memory of every fire that ever burned at their centers, and every person who ever sat beside those fires, and every winter that ever howled above them and failed every time to reach what lay below. If you had a grandparent who knew something the world has forgotten, a way of building, a way of growing, a way of surviving that no textbook ever recorded, what was it? Tell me in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the next story is about another kind of knowledge that almost disappeared and the woman who refused to let it go.